Trafalgar Square, the traditional venue for demonstrations, riots and unrest. 2 died in the Bloody Sunday riots of 1887. Thousands gathered here to protest against nuclear weapons, and the poll tax riots provided some of the defining moments of Margaret Thatcher's premiership. But the most violent was the one reported by the BBC on January the 16th, 1926. A riot significant not only for its timing, but also for the effect it had on early broadcasting. No recording exists of the broadcast, but we've been able to reconstruct what listeners heard from a surviving transcript.
The Test match. The closing score when stumps were drawn in the Test match was as follows. Australia, 569 for 7 wickets. The English team were all out for 173. The unemployed demonstration. The crowd in Trafalgar Square is now assuming threatening dimensions. Threatening dimensions are now being assumed by the crowd which has collected in Trafalgar Square. The crowd in Trafalgar Square is now proceeding to sack the National Gallery. The National Gallery was first erected in 1838 to house the famous Angerstein collection of pictures. It is now being sacked by the crowd. That concludes the news bulletin for the moment. The unemployed demonstration. The crowd is now pouring through the Admiralty Arch and is advancing towards the back of the government buildings in Whitehall in a threatening manner. Unemployed demonstration in London. The crowd has now passed along Whitehall and is preparing to demolish the Houses of Parliament with trench mortars. The 3 towers are 300 feet, 320 feet and 346 feet high, respectively. The clock tower, 320 feet in height, has just fallen to the ground, together with the famous clock Big Ben, which used to strike the hours on a bell weighing 9 tons. 1 moment, please. Fresh reports which have just come to hand announce that the crowd have secured the person of Mr. Wotherspoon, the Minister of Traffic, who was attempting to make his escape in disguise. He has now been hanged from a lamp post in the Vauxhall Bridge Road. One of the lamp posts in the Vauxhall Bridge Road has been utilised by the crowd for the purposes of hanging Mr. Wotherspoon, the Minister of Traffic. Hello, everybody. London calling. The Savoy Hotel has now been blown up by the crowd. That noise which you heard just now was the Savoy Hotel being blown up by the crowd at the instigation of Mr. Poppleberry, Secretary of the National Movement.
With news like that crackling over their earphones, it's no wonder that many BBC listeners panicked. Women fainted, men lectured their dinner party guests on the dangers of the coming communist revolution, and provincial mayors dusted off their town's emergency plans. The BBC, the Savoy Hotel, and newspaper offices around the country were bombarded with frantic phone calls. One angry listener even called the Admiralty and demanded that the Navy be dispatched up the Thames to quell the riot. People in rural areas continued gossiping about the destruction in London right through the weekend. It wasn't until Monday morning's newspapers arrived that many people learned the whole broadcast had been a spoof, written and delivered by a mischievous Catholic priest and detective novel writer called Father Ronald Knox.
From reports which have just come to hand, it appears that Sir Theophilus Gooch, who was on his way to this station, has been intercepted by the remnants of the crowd still collected in Trafalgar Square and is being roasted alive. Born in 1879, Sir Theophilus Gooch entered the service of Messrs.
To understand the full impact of Knox's broadcast, you need some insight into radio listening in January 1926. Paddy Scannell of the University of Westminster is author of A Social History of Broadcasting.
At that time, radio was only about 4 years old. And I suppose a basic point is that people at that time were not really familiar with listening to the radio in the way, of course, that we all are today. What we think of as, the radio set was just wasn't a standardized thing at that time. There was a very primitive thing called the cat's whisker, in which the sound was so faint that normally you amplified it by sort of holding a bowl or a basin to it. And that was one sort of weird way in which people listened. But the crystal set you had to listen to normally on earphones. So it was not a social sort of experience.
Against such a background, what do you think listeners would have made of this extraordinary broadcast?
Well, I'm sure they were completely flummoxed by it. I'm sure they really didn't know quite what to make of it. I imagine that if they had listened to it all the way through, that's to say from beginning to end, it would become progressively clearer that it was a joke. But if you just, sort of came in, as people often did, in the middle of a programme, and you only heard a little bit of it, you might think it was real.
The Admiralty Arch is being poured through by a crowd lately collected in Trafalgar Square, and the back of the government buildings in Whitehall is being approached in a threatening manner.
Meanwhile, as many as 10 million could have heard this broadcast. According to Alan Beck, lecturer in drama at the University of Kent, this was a new kind of audience for a medium whose popularity had by then spread far beyond the middle classes.
People who perhaps couldn't even afford gramophones in all regions of the country were for the first time listening in. So people in country regions, not in urban regions, were for the first time being reached.
And some of these people might have been listening to radio only for a few weeks before this broadcast actually went out.
This was a much more popular audience, an audience that were not involved in reading high-class journalism such as Punch and the quality papers, an audience that for the first time were getting all their information through one popular medium of broadcast, and an audience who perhaps could not read.
It was a time of fear and nervousness in Britain. The Zinoviev letter had raised the spectre of a communist takeover, and industrial unrest would soon lead to the general strike. According to Joanna Burke, Professor of History at Birkbeck College and author of Fear, A Cultural History, the broadcast very much reflected the current mood.
It was a wonderful example of how people's fears can seem so strange to us now in the 21st century, and how those fears change over time. One of the most important is, of course, this great fear in the 1920s of communism. The Communist Party was set up in 1920. We had the first Labour government. We had Clause 4, the common ownership of property. We had the first link up with the Soviet Union as a government, a trade act that was passed. So there are all these great fears. Of course, there's also the strike that's happening, the general strike. There are great worries that deference is on the wane, most definitely, and that the poor people, the unemployed herds, are going to not put up with being poor anymore.
When you actually look at the script, it's in the style of the BBC news bulletins, and it's treated as a breaking news story. The announcer, apparently, Ronald Knox, says,
1 minute, please. London calling. Continuation of news bulletin from reports which have just come to hand. The crowd in Trafalgar Square is now proceeding at the institution of Mr. Poppleberry, Secretary of the National Movement for Abolishing Theatre Queues, to sack the National Gallery. The National Gallery was first erected in 1838. It is now being sacked by the crowd. That concludes the news bulletin for the moment. You will now be connected with the band at the Savoy Hotel.
So, a new medium, a new audience, an atmosphere of civil unrest and mischief at the microphone. Yet it's more than a little odd that such broadcasting mayhem should have come from the pen of a distinguished Oxford divine.
Right, well, we're standing now in the vestibule to Trinity College Library. Here we have right beside us the bust of Ronald Arbuthnot Knox, 1888 to 1957, and I was asking the librarian whether she thought there was any resemblance between me and him, because he was my grandfather's first cousin. My mother's a Knox, and she didn't reply, so I don't know the answer to that. My name is Father Ian Carr, and I followed my relative, my distinguished as chaplain here, Catholic chaplain at Oxford, and I write books, although not such by no means such famous books as him. Well, Ronald Arbuthnot Knox was, in his generation, a very famous Catholic priest who had enormous influence. He wrote sermons which were published and were widely read throughout the English-speaking world. He also wrote religious apologetic books, popular explanations of Catholic doctrine. And on top of all that, he was a detective story writer. He wrote a number of satirical essays and also two or three satirical volumes. He wrote verse. He was a scholar. He wrote a famous scholarly work called Enthusiasm. He translated the whole Bible. He was a very eminent man in his time. He was a very close friend of Evelyn Waugh. He helped G.K. Chesterton become a Roman Catholic. On top of all his achievements, he was always a man of great wit and humour and enjoyed playing practical jokes upon people.
Trafalgar Square, and is being roasted alive. Born in 1879, Sir Theophilus Gooch entered the service of Messrs. Goodbody, the well-known firm of brokers. He very soon attracted the notice of his employers. However, nothing was proved, and Sir Theophilus retired with a considerable fortune.
In fact, the president of Trinity was saying to me before lunch that he's one of the great sort of speakers, in the history of the Oxford Union. So the Oxford Union is not something to be scorned, and he was a great speaker at that because he had a brilliant academic career, double first, and won prizes and so on.
Here he is in debating mode.
The newspaper is a screen to shut us off from our surroundings. It appears with breakfast, and immediately, propped up with some uncertainty against the coffee pot, it becomes a screen. It cuts off the British householder from the grim realities of life. I do hope, sir, that the House does not imagine me capable of such vulgarity as to refer in that way to the householder's wife.
The Oxford Union performance in 1939 gives the flavour of the man behind the programme, which he called Broadcasting the Barricades. It began at 7:40 p.m. By the time it ended 17 minutes later, Knox had convinced countless thousands of BBC listeners that the National Gallery had been sacked, an innocent man barbecued in Trafalgar Square, Big Ben flattened by trench mortars, a government minister lynched, and the Savoy Hotel blown to pieces. His first inkling of the programme's impact came about 20 minutes after it finished, when he was sitting down to supper at Edinburgh's Caledonian Hotel. Barely a forkful had passed his lips when Lord Reith, then just plain John Reith, the BBC's managing director, phoned to say that anxious phone calls were already pouring in. Many of those earliest calls were fielded by JCS McGregor, Knox's hapless sound effects man, who later recalled the experience in the BBC staff magazine.
The debris of the Savoy Hotel was still lying about the studio when the telephone bell rang. Was it true, asked an agitated voice, that revolution had broken out in London? The next caller was more difficult. His wife had a weak heart and had fainted at the news, and when he gathered from me that the whole thing was fictitious, he exploded. What, he asked with some vigour, did the BBC mean by it? Did we realise that we'd grossly misled the country and were playing into the hands of the Bolshevists?
The immediate impact was really dramatic all over the country, particularly in rural areas and isolated areas. People became very, very frightened. There was reports of people fainting. There were reports of at dinner parties, people actually going crazy about, what is happening in London. We have in Newcastle, the mayor becoming, the mayor's wife indeed, becoming very, very worried about how she should tell her husband, who was at a formal dinner and of course was not listening to the radio. And also in Newcastle, we have the sheriff thinking, oh, goodness, what have I got prepared? How can I protect my city from this awful thing that is happening in London? And because newspapers were delayed that day, because there was heavy snow in London, and so lots of people didn't get their newspapers, this all seemed to confirm this belief that something must be terribly, terribly wrong.
Hello everybody, London calling. The Savoy Hotel has now been blown up by the crowd. That noise, which you heard just now, was the Savoy Hotel being blown up by the crowd at the instigation of Mr. Poppleberry, Secretary of the National Movement for Abolishing Theatre Queues. 1 moment, please.
The sound of that explosion, supposedly wrecking the Savoy Hotel, was actually created by breaking up an orange box close to the microphone, an explosion that broke new ground in the use of sound effects in this newest of media. The newspapers already viewed the BBC as a very unwelcome competitor and took every opportunity to attack Knox and the BBC in the days following the Saturday evening transmission. Monday morning produced a barrage of press criticism.
Evening Standard. The BBC has unintentionally been responsible for the biggest scare known in Britain since the advent of broadcasting. Half the country over the weekend has been flooded with rumours of a great upheaval in London, and all because Father Ronald Knox broadcast some extracts from an imaginary news bulletin. Irish Times. The moral of the whole affair is rather humiliating. Humour and satire are dangerous implements when they're applied to mankind in the mass, and the BBC will be wise if, in future, it takes no risk with its public's average standard of intelligence.
Weekly Scotsman, 22nd January 1926. Many inquiries from Ireland perhaps betrayed more interest than concern.
Sir Leo got some money, the Daily Express. The item was utterly humourless. The BBC should be ashamed of having included it in their programme. I should not have made a worse joke if I'd rung you up on the telephone and announced that I'd murdered my grandmother.
Daily Mirror. Hundreds of people rang up amazed newspaper offices, asking for details and saying they had heard it from the BBC. In the west of England, rumours were still going round yesterday morning, and anxious inquiries were made to the police as to the truth of the report.
The Tablet, January 1926. There are in England groups of hireling communists who must have been enormously encouraged by the fact that many Britons were badly scared last Saturday. These Reds can now truthfully report to their employers that a Red Revolution is not unthinkable in England, seeing that even a burlesque account of it caused widespread alarm.
To be fair, the BBC, in denying that there had been any intention deliberately to cause alarm, pointed out that the broadcast had been introduced with an announcement about its humorous nature. Regret was, of course, expressed if anyone had been misled, but there was certainly no abject apology. And as his biographer Evelyn Waugh points out, Knox was equally unrepentant.
Ronald himself was not much cast down by his reception. His conscience was perfectly clear of any malicious intention, and he could not take seriously the annoyance of people so egregiously lacking in humour. A colleague remembers his unaffected delight in hearing himself roundly abused over their beer by two men in a fishing inn.
Knox replied to his critics in an interview in the Evening Standard and came out fighting, albeit languidly.
The idea for this skit came to me while I was at home, listening to the results of the last election being broadcast. I endeavoured to visualise then the breathlessness there would be throughout the country during a revolution, and I tried to imagine the news bulletins during such a time of popular excitement. I put my ideas on paper and then attempted to burlesque them. I had no idea that listeners would take what I said seriously. Even now, I cannot quite see how anyone could have misinterpreted my remarks. I am sure that my news reports were so ridiculously far-fetched that no one who thought them out could have been alarmed. Greenwich time will not be given this evening by Big Ben, but will be given from Edinburgh on Uncle Leslie's repeating watch. Uncle Leslie's repeating watch will be used for giving Greenwich time this evening instead of Big Ben, which has just fallen to the ground under the influence of trench mortars.
I think Knox was genuinely surprised by the reaction, as I say, because it had been made so clear at the beginning of the broadcast that this was a joke, a practical joke. And being a very clever and witty man himself, I suppose he, like clever people do tend to. They don't estimate how stupid other people can be. Well, he was so used to these sort of practical jokes, and it was very much that Edwardian style of the kind of class that he belonged to. These, the kind of crossword puzzle mentality, the cleverness, the dexterity, which they could. And there are lots of stories about various pranks he'd play upon people, and so he was used to growing up with clever and witty people, and I suppose he just didn't estimate the kind of audience who were likely to listen to this. But perhaps he was quite pleased that they had been taken in. He thought that the power of the media in those early days of broadcasting was something that needed to be sent up a bit, and that he was performing. I suppose he would have said a useful lesson to the public, that you don't believe everything that you hear on the wireless.
The British Broadcasting Company regrets that one item in the news has been inaccurately given. The correction now follows. It was stated in our news bulletin that the Minister of Traffic had been hanged from a lamp-post in the Vauxhall Bridge Road. Subsequent and more accurate reports show that it was not a lamp-post, but a tramway post, which was used for this purpose. A tramway post, not a lamp-post, was used by the crowd for the purpose of hanging the Minister of Traffic.
When, some 70 years later, satirist Chris Morris announced the fictitious death of a real prominent politician in the name of comedy, the BBC was not amused. So how did John Reith react to this lynching of a minister? Paddy Scannell.
Given that everybody thinks of Reith as a sort of a rather grim Scottish Calvinist, you might have expected him to be sort of full of wrath and apologies for the broadcast, but actually he was very pleased by it. And what the BBC was above all concerned with at that time was building its audience.
Some things never change.
No, absolutely not. Thrilled with the results because it proved that people were listening and they were responding. It was mentioned in his monthly report to the BBC's board of directors.
Report by Managing Director of the BBC, John Reith, to the Board of Directors, 11th February 1926. The outstanding item of last month was unexpected. Father Ronald Knox's broadcast aroused much public attention, but press criticism only produced an increase in the number of appreciations received by us. There were 2,307 appreciations as against 247 criticisms, of which 194 were immediately directed against Father Knox. The piano transmissions at 7:25 are proving popular.
And far from being contrite, the BBC board decided there would be more of the same.
It was agreed that an April Fool's Day programme should be arranged, and it was suggested that some suitable hoax might be arranged, somewhat on the lines of the Father Ronald Knox transmission of recent fame.
Knox appeared sporadically on the BBC over the next decade, notably a spoof scientific talk claiming scientists had learned to hear the sound of vegetables in pain. In 1939, he started translating the Bible, a vast task that consumed most of his energy until he died in 1957. Now he is best remembered for his wit rather than his theology. Broadcasting the Barricades made headlines in the US too. American journalists were keen to laugh at the foolish, gullible Brits. The New York Times was particularly smug.
English listeners to the radio were the victims Saturday evening of somebody whose sense of humour was peculiar. It occurred to a certain Father Ronald Knox that it would be funny to send out a dreadful tale of a labour rising in London. Great numbers of people who happened to tune in after the warning took it in all seriousness, and large numbers of people were filled with an anxiety as to the fate of their friends, relatives, and property. Such a thing as that could not happen in this country. We are safe from such jesting. Ladies and gentlemen, the director of the Mercury Theatre and star of these broadcasts, Orson Welles. We know now that in the earliest years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's and yet as mortal as his own.
The War of the Worlds was declared on October 30th, 1938, 12 years after broadcasting the Barricades, and used many of the same stylistic devices, from breaking news bulletins to interrupting dance music. We'll never know for sure, but it is possible that Wells was directly inspired by the BBC riot in Trafalgar Square. On the morning after his own panic broadcast, Wells gave a press conference on the chaos that War of the Worlds had caused, fending off questions from hostile reporters by saying, "The technique I used was not original with me. It was not new." Like Knox, Wells deliberately mixed fact and fiction for maximum effect. The difference is, as Alan Beck of the University of Kent argues, Knox got there 12 years earlier.
Knox was a prophet because in 1928 the BBC decided to invent features, which was a mix of genres. He was there first. He mixed variety, entertainment, burlesque with that element of news to shape a new form of features before it was properly born.
One moment, please. The more unruly members of the crowd are now approaching the British Broadcasting Company's London station with a threatening demeanour.
Could such a programme have any such effect today?
I remember a couple of years ago turning on the television one evening and watching what I thought was a documentary, and after about 5 minutes or so I thought, God, this is a weird bloody programme, and I realised, of course, that it was a spoof documentary. It was The Office.
One moment, please. Mr. Popplebury, Secretary of the National Movement for Abolishing Theatre Queues, with several other members of the crowd, is now in the waiting room.
This was still quite a naughty programme, wasn't it?
Oh, it was very mischievous, I'd say, because it's absolutely unsurprising that people were fooled by it. It was the BBC, after all.
The riot that never was finally diffused and exposed for the spoof that it was by another rather more innocuous BBC invention found by the rioters in the BBC waiting rooms.
They are reading copies of the Radio Times. Good night, everybody. Good night.